Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Random Watch Dude. So today I'm going to make a video about vintage watches. And I'll probably need to start by defining, as we need to do in this kind of day and age, what qualifies as a vintage watch. Because also we've obviously got the distinction that we need to make between modern, neo-vintage and vintage. So, and of course, I think these days neo-vintage and vintage get kind of piled into the same category. And not that I want to categorise watches strictly, but I think it's probably a good idea to start with, the definition of what actually a vintage watch is. So I've kind of come up with the three different eras of watches, if you like. And of course, we'll start with the modern era, the era that we're in now. And I've kind of put a classification around the modern era of watches as those watches that go back up to 20 years ago. So between now, which is now 2024, and somewhere around 2004, that would qualify to me as the modern era of watches. Now, as an example, today I'm wearing my Planet Ocean 2208.5. This is the 45.5mm big size Planet Ocean. This watch is from 2005. So this just about kind of qualifies as still a modern watch, although I do have a slightly older 2254.5. Now the production date on that is around 2000. So that makes it around 25 years old, and that to me qualifies then as neo-vintage. So neo-vintage to me is any watch that's between 20 years old and 40 years old. So there's a 20. So I'm doing this in 20-year segments basically. So 0 to 20 is modern. 20 to 40, I'm calling that neo-vintage, and then anything that's over 40 years old, I'm calling that vintage. Now, to be very clear, there's no formal classification for what qualifies as modern, neo-vintage and vintage. I'm just telling you that I think that's a reasonable sort of rough, I guess, grouping to go with in terms of the age of the watch. So, and I think really for the purpose of this video, we don't necessarily just have to talk about vintage watches. We can throw neo-vintage into that category as well, because like I say, there's no formal classification. So, anything over, really guys, anything over 20 years old in watch terms is bloody old, isn't it, actually? Let's be honest with you. So it's probably been serviced 3 or 4 times, once a watch gets to about 10, 15, 20 years old. So yeah, it's got a bit of history, and I think it's fair to call it vintage. So with that out of the way, guys, and just to qualify, I guess, this video, I do have a reasonable amount of experience with neo-vintage and vintage watches. I mean, just recently, for example, I've just bought this, which although I'm calling modern, it's just about to fall into the category of neo-vintage. I've bought loads and loads of neo-vintage watches, guys, watches that are 10, 15, 20 years old, 25, 30 years old. I've bought lots of them, and when I say lots, that's relative, isn't it? I'm probably saying I'm going to have bought 25, 30, neo-vintage watches, and then vintage watches as well. I've bought watches that go right back to the 60s, the 1960s, and I've bought quite a lot of watches that fall into the category of the 1970s. So and again, in terms of numbers, I've probably had 15, 20 watches that fall into the category of 1960s, 1970s. So very, very much in the vintage classification. Now the purpose of this video really is just to sort of give you guys an introduction into my view on vintage watches and neo-vintage watches, and things to look out for, and I want to start also with the pros and cons of and I won't call it collecting vintage watches, but let's call it the vintage watch hobby. Because there are some distinct pros to it, and there are also some very, very distinct negatives or cons to it. So I'll just go over those quickly. So I've got 3 key pros to getting into vintage and neo-vintage watches. One is, without question, if you get yourself immersed in the vintage and neo-vintage watch hobby, you are going to start finding watches that have got a significant amount of charm and uniqueness and individuality. And that is relative to the watches that we're all exposed to, the modern watches that we're all exposed to today, which without question are by far and away more advanced and technically better watches than vintage and neo-vintage watches in terms of the technology. But I think it's fair to say that one of the great things about getting into vintage watches is that you're starting to, look at watches that have got a lot of personality, and depending on the exact types of watches that you get into, you can find some really unique ones, and actually just have something different and something unique on your wrist, something that's just not the norm in the watch world. And I think that's a distinct advantage of being into vintage watches, is that individuality that vintage watches have and can give you, the wearer. The second thing is, without question, guys, I mean, watch collecting, this hobby is very much an emotive hobby, isn't it? We make purchases based on, the emotions that are evoked in us by a watch. It's kind of man jewelry, really, isn't it? And woman jewelry, of course. There's a lot of women into watches too. But I think, when it comes to nostalgia, especially when you get to a guy that's my age. I mean, I consider myself to be vintage. I'm turning 50 this year, and so I guess that qualifies me as a vintage person. There's a lot of nostalgia attached to having a watch that might be as old as you, or even older. So that, one of the advantages of vintage and neo-vintage is you're starting to wear pieces of jewellery that might be older than you, and there's something really I think nice about that in terms of the history that watch brings with it. You've got your history, and that watch brings its own history as well. So nostalgia is another advantage of being into vintage watches. And number three, and I think this is quite an important one as well, when you think that these days how much money do you have to drop on a half-decent watch now? And when I say half-decent, I mean like a half-decent Swiss mid-tier watch. You're not going to get much change out of, 5, 6, 7,000, are you? Well, the great thing about vintage watches is you can get... It won't have the same technology as the modern watches, but you can get a watch that was the best quality of its day. In other words, it was the Patek Philippe of its day, the Rolex Submariner of its day. But you can pick some watches up, some vintage watches that they're actually fantastic quality, for, I don't know, 500, 600, 700, $1,000. You can actually come in from an affordability scale. You can actually come in really low with vintage watches if you want to, and still pick up a really, really good watch, a great watch with great history, great quality. And they're the three key things, guys, that I think are advantages of being into vintage watches and just immersing yourself into the hobby. Negatives, drawbacks of being into vintage watches. Look, it's not like you walk into your local AD and you try and buy, try before you buy. You can have a look around. You can get the dealer to pull lots of different watches out of the shelf, and they can talk to you about the specs. And it's got a 5-year guarantee or a 10-year guarantee. I think Oris do a 10-year guarantee now. You don't get any of that with a vintage watch. So with vintage watches, you've got to make sure that you find a good one, because, and that leads to number 2, if you don't find a good one, you're going to have a heck of a time finding parts for it, finding potentially somebody to service it. And also, if you can find someone to service it, the parts for that watch might be actually exponentially more expensive than the watch was to start with. So the running costs of a watch, and that's number 2, is the running costs and the parts availability can be a challenge. So you really, really have to be mindful of the watch that you're buying, and making sure that you've got a good one. And the third drawback or negative, and I did touch on this just now, was that the technology and the quality of those watches is without question not as good as a modern watch. So most vintage watches still use 316L stainless steel, so the corrosion resistance is still very good. There's still a marine grade stainless, most of them. But the actual quality, the thickness of the steel, the quality of the seals that they were using, the quality of the crystal, for example. There was no sapphire crystal for any vintage watch. It was all, kind of the, just like the hezolite crystal that you see on some older watches, which can be cracked, it can be brittle. So the quality of the watch is something that you're going to have to get your head around. It's not as good as modern watches. But these things, to be honest with you, although I'm saying that as a negative, these things all add to the charm, I think, of the vintage watch hobby, and finding a good one, which is really important. So guys, just really just to round this off, because I will be making lots of videos on the vintage watch collecting hobby as we go along, but I wanted to start off really with a video about the pros and cons, and what's vintage, what's neo vintage. And I just want to finish on just some key points. If you're considering getting into vintage watches, I've got some key points that I'd like you to consider around the broad title of where do I start. Where do I start in this hobby of collecting vintage watches? How do I get going? What am I supposed to be looking for? So I've got three pieces of advice for you on this. The first one is identify a specific brand, type of watch that you're interested in, and try and hone in. In other words, try and focus your attention on a specific area of the vintage watch sphere, because the vintage watch sphere is absolutely enormous. You're talking 50, 60, 70 years worth of watch manufacturing and production, not just the last 2 or 3. You're looking at 50, 60 years worth of watches that are out there in the watch world. They're all talking to you saying, buy me, buy me. And my advice to you guys is be very clear with yourself on what type of vintage watch you want. And of course, some of that will be based around the budget that you have as well. Most, 70-80% of vintage watches that you see there for sale are going for less than $1,000, guys. So look, don't be worried, don't be put off, by what I'm saying here. But just be very clear with yourself about what type of vintage watch you're looking for. Narrow the field. That's the key thing. Narrow the field down, because it's a massive field. You'll get yourself in a right pickle trying to figure out what you want. If you just start looking at vintage watches on auction websites, you'll just get in a right mess, and you won't know what you want, and it might put you off. So just be very clear, narrow the field. The other thing, and this is actually just a word of advice, is and it's fun as well, and this helps narrow the field significantly, is how about a birth watch? How about a birth year watch? And an example of that is, as I said earlier, I'm nearly 50. I'm turning 50 this year, so my birth year is 1974. And I've owned a couple of vintage watches which I know were manufactured in 1974, and that's quite nice. It's a bit of fun. I even had a King Seiko, and I'll put a picture up of it here. I had a King Seiko. This is going back 2 or 3 years now, maybe even longer actually. It might have been about 5 years ago I got this watch. Not only was it a birth year King Seiko from 1974, but it was also a birth month. So I could tell by the serial number on the back of that watch, which was the great thing about Seikos, was that you can actually tell the month and the year that watch was manufactured by the serial number, and it's very accurate. So I knew that watch was actually made in February 1974, and that was great. And I spent quite a lot of time looking for that particular watch. I wanted a Seiko, or a King Seiko, or a Grand Seiko. I got one that was my exact birth month and year, so that's a bit of fun. That's a way of narrowing the field down, and it also gets you that nostalgia that I mentioned earlier, and it also helps you identify a particular type of watch, because I knew that the only way I was going to guarantee myself a February 1974 watch was probably to go for a Seiko, because I knew that the serial numbers would tell me very clearly, unless I found a watch that had box and papers, which is nigh on impossible for a watch that old. I knew that if I went Seiko, I would be able to look at the serial number and tell the month and the year of manufacture. So that's how I narrowed the field, and I got a beautiful King Seiko, and it had the original bracelet as well, which was big enough for my wrist. So I was chuffed with that, guys. Of course I sold it, like you stupidly do. I sold it after a year or two, but that was fun. That was fun, and that was a way of narrowing the field. Point number 2, guys, and I think it relates to point number 1 to a degree, is do your homework. The vintage watch sphere, it's a massive rabbit hole, guys. You can really get yourself, and like I said earlier, you can get yourself in a right mess. Just looking at skimming over the surface of vintage, you can get yourself in a right kerfuffle. So do your homework, narrow the field. And when you've identified a specific genre or type of watch that you want, is take a long time doing your homework on it. Study the Facebook groups are a great source of information, by the way. I thoroughly recommend those. Immerse yourself into type of watch that you're looking for. Immerse yourself into the history of it. Make sure you understand what it's supposed to look like. Make sure you understand that, you know, if you're looking for a vintage dive watch, you know, and it's going to have a black bezel, let's say, because most of them did then. They didn't do blue and green bezels back then. It was black or black. You know, make sure that you know what the font should look like. Make sure you understand how an aged bezel that's 40, 50 years old should have aged, because believe it or not, and it's very sad to say, there's a lot of people out there that are faking vintage bezels. So they're taking a brand new bezel and aging it, if you like. And sometimes they do a very good job and they age it in acid, or they rub it with sandpaper or whatever. And so do your homework. Be mindful of the fact that there's a lot of Franken watches out there, a lot of fakes. You know, a lot of people that have aged a watch to make it look older than it really is. So, and you know, you can avoid all of that. These you can see all these things, by the way. These are not things that are totally unavoidable. You should, if you've done your homework and you know what you're looking at, you should be able to identify if a watch has been Frankensteined, as it were. So do your homework. It's really, really important, and take as long as you can on doing that. There's no rush. And third, guys, you know, just, you know, I don't know how to put this other than to say you just have to accept that in the vintage watch hobby, you know, like in, I guess you could relate it to the antiques collecting hobby, there's a lot of risk involved. You know, you can pay too much. It's very rarely do you pay too little and get yourself a massive bargain. You know, if a watch is really, really good, it's going to cost you some money, but you also need to be aware of the risks of buying that watch as well. You know, if it needs a service, if the mainspring is completely shot, you know, and you've got to pay $300 to get a new mainspring, you know, you just got to be aware of these things, and you just got to accept that, you know, you can do all your homework in the world and you can do all the analysis in the world and making sure that you're buying the right watch for the right money, but the risks associated with vintage watches are higher, and you just need to be aware of it. And for me, guys, that's part of being in the game. You know, the watch, you know, you got to take care out there. The watch has been, you know, on someone's wrist potentially for the last 30, 40, 50 years. So it's going to have picked up some knocks and some problems, potentially. You just need to be aware of it. And finally, in terms of where to go, you know, to look for vintage watches, of course, go to eBay. Of course, go to Chrono24. Do your homework on the internet, like we all do. I would also recommend joining Facebook groups. You know, once you've got an idea of what type of watch that you're looking for, is go on Facebook and look for groups, you know, because there will be dedicated groups, and there are hundreds of vintage watch Facebook groups out there, and if you want to get yourself an Omega Seamaster, like I do, a 166.010 with a crosshair dial, preferably on the bracelet with box and papers, just serviced, you know, there may be one for sale on one of these specialist Facebook groups. And the great thing about buying through a specialist group is that all the other members that are on that group are probably looking at that watch, and if there's something wrong with it, and particularly if it's a fake, you know, it'll get highlighted pretty quickly. So you can actually be part of that community. And the vintage watch community is vast, by the way, and I thoroughly recommend, if you want to get into vintage watches, to get yourself into the community on Facebook. And finally, guys, it's a rabbit hole. You know, my words of caution would be, take a big deep breath before you get into it, because it's a very deep rabbit hole, and there's no telling how long you're going to be in it and when you're going to come out of it. But if you get the right watch quickly and you manage to get out, congratulations, because there are a lot of people out there that have been in that hobby for many years and they're still digging. So good luck, guys, and hey, look, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video if it's the kind of content that you like. And guys, yeah, I'll be releasing more videos soon, talking more about vintage watches and my experience with vintage watches. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.